Twitter investment was roughly, 2011. Fund 1 in 2012. The first 5 companies they invested in all went public in the US. Most of the best entrepreneurs I've ever worked with build their company from the very first day for the global market. What would I love to see from Japanese startups?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to see them incorporated in Delaware, operating from day one in English, so that you can go to Great Britain and you can go to the United States from the very first moment you launch, because finding product market fit is hard. Restricting yourself to just one market is limiting your ambition. I would love to see startups in Japan that come to our office in Shinmaru and pitch us on their company that is global from the beginning.
Welcome to Startup Now. I'm your host, Kazuya Inarida. People call me Oinari. And today I'm here outside of my studio. Here is the Tokyo Big Site. The reason why I'm here is that in this venue is called Sushitech Tokyo 2026. And I'm a media person of this conference. Today I invite a super special guest, Rob Freelen, and from Sozo Ventures and Managing Director. Thank you for coming today, Rob-san.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I attended your session. So I mean, you were the speaker of this huge conference. It proves that you were a special guest. In the session, you were the moderator. So I want more your insight. So let me interview over 30 minutes or so.
Sounds great.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think Sozo Venture is well-known venture capital, but young entrepreneur in Japan like me don't know Sozo Ventures too much because the founder of the Nakamura-san is too much legend, or you invest mainly in the US startups, so not Japanese. So I want to know more about yourself and Sozo Ventures. So please tell me.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sozo Ventures was created by Nakamura-san and my other partner, his co-founder, Phil Wickham, in roughly 15 years ago. They started the firm with the idea that Japan is a special place for lots of reasons, not least of which many of the world's best corporations are headquartered here. And there was a really meaningful and big opportunity in front of them to be able to be the bridge between global startups, and at that point, 15 years ago, most of those were in the United States. That's a lot has changed since then, but be the bridge between global startups and Japan, because those global corporations that are foundation of the Japanese economy they're amazing companies, but they weren't innovating internally as much as they wanted. According to their executives, and there was a big opportunity to be able to help bring startups to help them do that. So Nakamura-san and Phil were in roughly 2010 starting to look around for what different startups might be relevant in Japan that they would be excited to invest in and help bring here to this market. They found Twitter and worked with Jack Dorsey for a long period of time, designing a strategy where a consumer would walk into Lawson and this was Nakamura-san's idea, walk into Lawson and sign up for Twitter, scan a QR code, and get Punta points. And those loyalty points were valuable enough to drive more than 3 times Twitter's expectation for the number of monthly signups they could achieve in 1 month. So that was a very successful launch, and the company actually wrote that strategy of partnering with different organizations and sharing data anonymously between them after purchases. They wrote that into their filing to go public in the United States when they went public, and a lot has happened with Twitter since then. But the company was very successful in launching here in Japan, and it began the Sozo journey that has continued, and I've now been able to be lucky enough to be a part of, having joined about 4 years ago.
So please tell me more in other portfolio besides Twitter?
Sure. So the Twitter investment was roughly 2011, and then Phil and Co raised Fund 1 in 2012 and invested in the first 5 companies they invested in all went public in the U.S., which was very abnormal for a first-time venture fund.
Right.
But they invested in MongoDB and Fastly and Palantir and a bunch of great companies that have since gone public and been very successful. And, so since that first fund and since the Twitter investment, the firm's invested in some amazing companies in addition to those, Zoom, Coinbase, more recently companies like Applied Intuition. That have where Applied Intuition we're actually hosting in our office in Shinmaru tonight for an event, and that company is likely to go public, I believe, and they already have 100 employees just in Japan. So the vision that Co and Phil had was, if we bring the best startups in the world to Japan, what we're going to deliver back to the Japanese ecosystem are a lot of jobs, and you're giving those people, those Japanese citizens, jobs not just to work at the company, but eventually those people will go out and create their own companies, and that's where it gets exciting for Japan in trying to build greater amounts of innovation here domestically, and we're definitely seeing the growth in jobs from our portfolio with companies like Applied Intuition have happened very rapidly.
Thank you. Yeah, so interesting. And I noticed that your passion to the startup and the Japanese ecosystem also. And I want to know more about why you hold this passion about the startup or the Japanese ecosystem. So please tell me more about yourself.
Sure.
So especially before the business persons, I mean, where are you from? And I heard that you lived in the Stanford University. Now, I want to know more about this story.
Yeah. As a kid, I grew up on the Stanford University campus. So born and raised on the campus and lived there until I was in early high school, at which time my father retired and moved us away from campus. But it was a really unique way to grow up because the home that I lived in for most of my childhood was owned by Stanford University, and it was for the person in my father's job. So he was vice president for public affairs, and and what that meant was that he did a tremendous amount of the entertaining government relations, which meant people were in our home, and my mother did all of the cooking, whether it was dinner for the Stanford University president and a couple of small groups from campus, or whether it was Gorbachev actually visited Stanford University in, I believe it was the late 80s, right before the centennial celebration. And I remember as a kid there being lots and lots of big, large men talking into their sleeves one day at my house, and what that was, it was a preparation for this visit by President Gorbachev from Russia, and we hosted the lunch that happened before the official meeting on campus, and that was a pretty normal occurrence in my household, where we would entertain in our home with people from all over the world, and they would often give a talk or a speech or hold a roundtable discussion at our dining room table. And so my childhood was very rich in ideas and diversity of sort of guests in our home, and I loved it. And I've always wanted to replicate that for my children. I have 3 daughters, and my wife and I live just north of the Golden Gate Bridge near San Francisco. So my upbringing dramatically informed my thinking about what I wanted to do as a career, and how I approach business, which is to say, I believe that shared experience is one of the most important things you can do to understand the character of people around you. And so I regularly host dinners with our team and with our portfolio companies and our LPs, our investors. So I find that that's over a meal is one of the best ways to get to know someone, and that was probably largely informed by my parents' decision to raise us in a house where there were lots and lots of guests of all different backgrounds and origins, and require that my brother and I, who I have a younger brother, require that we participate in that experience, serving hors d'oeuvres and helping host in our own home, and later helping cook even. So that's been probably my biggest source of influence from the perspective of how I go about business.
So this special situation made you took the major in psychology in the university.
That's right.
Yeah, I wondered that your first career is the SV bank.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so the first 20 or so years of my career, I spent a brief period of time at a startup and an asset management firm before that, or following that startup experience. And then I was really interested in 2005 to try and find a way to go into finance for startups. I liked startups. It was a little risky for me. I liked finance a lot. It's its own language, and I wanted to combine them. And in 2005, I found myself interviewing for a role at Silicon Valley Bank, and I took that. I'm really happy I took that. I spent 17 years there. Wow. It was a phenomenal organization, and a lot of the people who I worked with very, very extensively still work at the organization that acquired Silicon Valley Bank after its unfortunate demise in 2023, and that's that organization, First Citizens, is continuing the work that we began at SVB and doing a great job of it.
Do you keep having the passion for startups while you work for the Silicon Valley Bank?
Yes, I mean, in fact, like Silicon Valley Bank wouldn't actually have existed in the way that when I joined in 2005. It was the largest financial services organization for startups in the world. I mean, by assets, by number of companies banked, by pretty much every measurement. At the point where I remember the statistics most recently, Silicon Valley Bank was working with over 55, almost 60% of all U.S. venture capital-backed startups. So everything I did was startups for those 17 years, really, or venture capital. And so I was in that period of time, I was lending money to those companies. I had to pretty deeply understand their business model in order to do that intelligently. We lent money to and did effectively every banking service for many of the biggest and best startups in the U.S. And then eventually globally. And that global expansion was always interesting to me. I remember actually I met Phil in 2007, so almost 20 years ago. I had taken Japanese in college, and so my Japanese is not good enough to want to speak with you and embarrass myself, but it is my understanding and appreciation of the culture came from 5 or 6 classes taken in Japanese art and aesthetics, Buddhism, Taoism, Shinto, and so I have a deep appreciation for how different the culture is, and what I think I can learn being from the United States and seeing a very different way of thinking. And when I met Phil in 2007, we connected over Japan. He hadn't yet started Sozo, but he said to me, there's a couple of these organizations come through once a year. INCJ was one of them that I remember introducing to the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank at the time, and saying, Japan at some point will become an interesting startup market, was my pitch to our CEO. I said, no culture and community that values and appreciates engineering and precision as much as Japan does. is going to be bad at startups or bad at innovation. And just because they haven't yet begun a real sort of investment into startups doesn't mean they won't. And now we fast forward to 2026, I am absolutely seeing a lot of interest in startups from founders born in Japan. My history with the country doesn't go back that long, in that my first visit here was 2022. But my Japanese professor was the one who married my wife and I. He was our officiant. And I had long appreciated the language and the art and the culture. And so it's really fun to be here at Sushi Tech, to be working with Japanese corporations and helping them bring innovation into Japan with startups, which is an area that I know deeply, and I'm learning and excited about the Japanese business ecosystem.
Yeah, I wonder that you have many options to join the other VCs also, or the other bankers, but you got be interested in Japan, so you joined the Sozo Ventures.
I did. So I had met Phil in 2007, and in 2022, the firm was successful in raising more money and needed another partner. And he said, "Have you ever thought about joining a venture capital fund?" And I said, I think about it all the time. I've talked to a bunch, and I've thought about joining several of them pretty seriously. I said, but why would I be good at this job? And his response to me was, you know startups better than almost anyone in the world. Having worked with more of them than most venture capitalists. As a venture lender, as a startup banker, I probably made loans to 20 or 30 companies a year. The average venture capitalist does, 1, 2, maybe 4 deals in a year. But we didn't get to work with them as deeply. So I was intrigued by the idea of coming to Sozo, doing similar kind of work, but being able to go deeper with the companies. And his pitch to me was, you know startups, and you know deals, and you know how to be in service of the people around you, of entrepreneurs. And so it means you're not going to have any of the bad habits that someone with a long history in the venture capital industry might, but you can do what we do, and you already know deals. So help us find the great companies, and then help us take them to Japan if you're passionate about that. And I said, I'm definitely passionate about that.
Yeah,
and,
great.
It was a very interesting conversation that happened pretty quickly.
Thank you so much. And I heard that you also have your own company, in the fintech company. So
that's right.
When did you start this company?
I started that company only a few months before Phil came and talked to me about joining Sozo. So when I started the company, I said, I'm not sure what my plan is going to be for my next role, but if I don't get this role at Sozo Ventures, I'll come join you full time. And if I do get the role at Sozo Ventures, then we can probably work together, and I'll stay a founder and advise, and maybe we'll invest. And so that company's called Turbine Finance. And what we do is we make loans to people that have invested in venture capital funds and don't want to sell their position because they think it's highly valuable, but they want some liquidity. So we make them loans on, fractions, some amount of the value that they have accrued in their position as an LP.
So as you know, in the Japanese VC, so we have to focus to just one job. So I mean the only VC and not the founder. But in the US, there is the popular word, so not so rare case that do the founder and the VC capitalist in parallel.
It does happen a fair amount. For me, I don't work day to day with Turbine. It's really an advisor role, but I've heard a lot of people say being a founder is like being a parent. You're never not a parent, right? Even when your kids grow up and you don't have to take care of them and change their diaper, you certainly are always their parent. And the same is true for a startup. we had the 3 co-founders, 2 who are still there at the company, and I are, we're deeply committed to the mission of that company. But I have a day job at Sozo Ventures and so I can only be an advisor and help, attend board meetings because I sit in a board seat. So my interaction with that company really isn't that different than any other company we invest in, where I might serve on the board or in an advisory capacity. It just so happens that I care a lot more, about every decision because I'm deeply involved since the beginning.
Yeah, sounds great. And also, your business is very near to what you do in Sozo Ventures. I mean, the liquidity of the LP's money. Tell me more about your business.
The business of Turbine is to, say you invest $1 million into a venture capital fund, and after 8 years, that $1 million is now worth $5 million. Turbine would potentially, we would underwrite the fund and we'd look at all the positions in the fund and determine what we thought the safe residual enterprise value was. So if we agreed that yes, this position, this group of companies is worth your $5 million, we think is worth the exact same as what the venture capital fund thinks, and we're willing to lend you $1 million to buy a house, to fund your college, your college education for your child, or whatever it is that you want to do with that money as the LP. We free up that liquidity. So in the same way that you can take a margin loan, against your Amazon stock or your SoftBank stock, you can get a Turbine loan against your LP position. So the idea is it helps the venture capitalists with, sometimes LPs will take a loan to invest back into the next fund. So it helps the venture capitalists in that use case, and it makes their LPs happy, which they always like, and there currently is almost no other solution that I know of where an individual can get a loan against a private equity position in the way that we're doing it.
Strongly needed in this
strongly
ecosystem.
Needed and not uncomplicated. It's a hard business to run, as it's a hard lending business to run safely. But we, our founding team and our employees at Turbine have really strong understanding of the venture capital industry, and my 2 of the co-founders, myself and Corey Wagner, both spent more than a decade at SVB, and so we have seen the cycles where venture capital positions are worth a lot, and then all of a sudden in a down period they're worth a lot less, according to the fluctuations in valuation that are normal.
Yeah, great. And I want to know your investment. So,
sure.
As I heard you before, you're originally from the bank, and you're the founder of the fintech. And the Sozo also invested the software company mainly. So, but recently you invest other industries also. So like the healthcare or the robotics also. So
yes.
I want to know more.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Sozo is by design a generalist firm. Our belief is that the industries that are going to be in favor are going to change over every 10-year period. Yeah. Today robotics is hot. AI is, almost the only thing anyone can talk about. And we don't believe that being specifically dedicated to one industry is the best way to run a fund like ours. Our belief is that we can deliver great returns to our LPs by maintaining lots of flexibility and investing across industries. So the things that we invest in are things that we see as potentially dramatically changing the future of society, right? So it's not just software. Some of my investments since joining Sozo are carbon robotics. Yeah. Which, it's a physical AI company, right? They use lasers and high-powered optics and a deep learning model powered by NVIDIA GPUs to identify the difference between a plant and a weed when they're only this big. And when a weed or a plant is only this big, it's very hard to have enough resolution. And then while you're driving over a field, locate the weeds, target them with a targeting system, and then fire a laser with 1 millimeter accuracy, and have it work and actually do a great job replacing the work of that's backbreaking labor for those people that have to otherwise pick those weeds by hand. So it's a really interesting company. The carbon robotics team is here in Japan this week. The CEO lands, I believe, in a few days, and what they're doing is they're actually doing some beta testing. So they've created a Japan-specific laser weeder, and they're taking it around to farmers and showing it to them and weeding their fields for free, just to test. And so it's a different machine than we sell elsewhere in the world, but we're selling the other versions of that machine, from Australia to the Netherlands, all over the United States. There's over there's well over 100 of these machines in circulation, and if you, in certain parts of the world, such as the Salinas Valley in California, where most of California's leafy greens, bok choy, arugula, romaine lettuce, are grown in Salinas Valley, and the majority of those leafy greens are now laser weeded, because it's the most efficient way to weed with tremendous precision. And in an economic fashion. It's actually profitable to use this machine, even though it's an expensive piece of machinery. So we're bringing it to Japan, and we're excited about it. And we are in the process of doing those first tests and gathering feedback. And then we'll use that feedback. And the team at Carbon is incredible at iterating on hardware and software, and what they'll do is they'll make changes to both the hardware and the software, and then begin work on starting to scale up and build a commercial version of the machine for Japan, which is built on different wheel spacing, and it's smaller and lighter, so that a smaller tractor can actually pull it, and it's also self-powered, where in the US, you just plug it into the tractor and it powers off of the tractor. We think those adaptations are what's required to make it successful in Japan.
That's exactly you became the gateway of Japan to US. So Japan is the good test field.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, thank you. So your investment is not based on the industry, but your investment policy. I found the policy in your website that is called
Readiness.
Readiness, exactly. Yeah. Tell me more about this. Yeah.
I mean, our concept around the stage at which we invest is we define as readiness. And what that really means is for companies that when they start selling their product, sometimes an early stage company is ready to go global from the very first moment that it's founded. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. Sometimes it takes a company until, 2, 3, 5, 10 years into their life in order to be ready to go global.
Yeah.
So we wanted a term that would help define for our investors, for our LPs, how we think about the world. And so for instance, Jack Dorsey, right? He's now built and run a number of companies. When he did Square, he was ready to go international and start selling internationally much faster than the average entrepreneur because of his experience at Twitter. Right? So if you have had the experience of doing an international launch and making mistakes and fixing them and figuring out how to be successful despite your early mistakes, your ability to learn and adapt and launch internationally sooner than another company is very high. a very seasoned entrepreneur might be ready at seed stage or Series A, but a first-time entrepreneur might decide that they want to just focus on their core market, whether it's the U.S. or Europe or Japan. They might want to focus on that one market alone for some period of time until they understand it well enough to be prepared to go to another market. And so what we want to help companies prepare for and launch in Japan.
Yeah.
And we want to do that when each one of those unique individual companies is ready. And so, for Carbon Robotics, they've raised Series D, as in David, and they are, they were formed in 2018, so they're 8 years in, right? From their first, basically the time at which they really first started in on the product. And so 8 years is somewhat long. We have another company, Doppel, who's actually one of the executives is here at Sushi Tech. And Doppel is only a few years old. And they already landed, so they have a cybersecurity product, and they're already working with one of the mega banks in a very meaningful commercial agreement, and they're working with J.P. Morgan, the biggest bank in the United States, and they're working with a number of other companies in different geographies in a very short period of time because they were ready to do it sooner. Number one, based on their product, but number two, based on the people that they have around them, their advisors, their executives. They were ready to launch internationally sooner than a lot of other companies. So there's no one answer for Sozo Ventures on exactly where we invest. But oftentimes it's sort of post-product market fit, and the company is maybe launched one international geography and is thinking about what the next one is.
As you mentioned before, it takes the decades to success in the startup. But I think most of the Japanese company can't stand it for the 10 years. But Sozo's most of the LP is Japanese company. So
right.
I can't believe that. Why you could involve the Japanese company so much?
We involve them because they're part of our business strategy, right? So we don't need to have only Japanese LPs because we, as a team, have developed a really strong network over the last 15 years. So we probably wouldn't have to take any money from Japan. If we didn't want to, we would still be able to maintain those relationships by simply doing good work for those large corporations in Japan. But we like for them to be invested in our success because they do absolutely pay more attention to us because they're investors in our fund. And so the idea is bring in Japanese corporations to be investors in our fund, and in the process of doing that, have them help us, evaluate startups, have a work on POCs together, and find ways to bring innovation into those large corporations that is, inorganic, so to speak, right? It's not done in-house.
So Japanese LPs, not only the financial return, also the strategic return.
Ideally, when we do our best work, our LPs get to build their businesses larger as a result of their interactions with startups. But we always say that you can't really get meaningful strategic return without financial return because it's really only the top 1% of companies that attract venture capital are the ones that deliver all the value, right? Because really it's only ever going to be the top few that both produce returns and change their industry, right? So if you look at space, how many space companies do you know of, deeply that are venture capital backed?
In Japan? No, all over the
anywhere.
world. Wow.
How many great ones are there?
Yeah. 10 words. So
I know of more because we invest, but I would bet that the average American, where there's a lot of companies, attracting venture capital dollars into their space company, I bet they mostly know one. they know SpaceX,
Oh,
right?
really?
Because SpaceX is having such an outsized impact on the space industry.
Yeah.
So in every industry, there's going to be those 1 or 2 or 3 companies that, our other company, Applied Intuition, right? They're one of the most impactful companies that are in the vehicle space, right? For autonomy. If you go to video conferencing, how many video conferencing platforms do you know of?
Oh, Zoom, Teams, and just yeah.
But the top 2 companies make up a massive percentage of that industry. So our belief is that you have to be in those 1 or 2 companies that lead the industry in order to get financial return. And those are the companies whose products are the best, which is why they usually win, almost always.
Yeah, correct.
And when the products are the best, those are the ones that give you strategic return also. So our deep belief is that those strategic and financial return are deeply tied, and that's our goal, is to deliver that, both of those.
So clear. And in Japan, it's becoming too difficult to maintain the IPO. The Tosho changed the rule to maintain to keep the post IPO.
Yes.
Then Japanese companies stuck to invest the startup market. I see. But what do you think about this situation?
I would tell you that I think that the US IPO market is too restrictive. You have to be too big to go public. Very few IPOs happened in the US in the last few years.
Really?
I don't think that's good for the stock market because it prevents retail investors like you and me from buying shares on the open market of a company until it's tremendously valuable. And you miss a lot of the appreciation potential.
Yeah.
By contrast, Japan, you can go public with very small revenue. Do I think that's ideal? I don't know, but I usually believe that most answers of for markets, you wind up concluding that neither the best nor the most lenient market nor the most restrictive market are the best. Somewhere in between is usually the right balance for markets. So I think Japan is smart to test and learn and raise the requirements a little bit to see if that improves the overall startup and IPO market in Japan, so that you get a better outcome.
And I want to know more about the Japanese startup ecosystem. So you said that the good point of the Japanese startup ecosystem, but I want to know more about the bad point, or the point should improve to be the global.
Sure.
Yeah.
We don't invest very much in Japan. I've never lived here, so I don't consider myself an expert on Japanese startups. That's first. That said, what I hear often when I talk to other investors who do invest here is that many companies are built for Japan. And I think that most of the best entrepreneurs I've ever worked with build their company from the very first day for the global market. Now, there are some markets that are different. Fintech is a little bit different, in consumer at least. And there are some other nuances in certain geographies, but for the most part, the Sam Altmans of the world start out from day zero building a company with the idea that I'm not going to change most of the world. I'm going to change the whole world, or the whole industry across the globe, and that it's that ambition that leads them to operate in English and be a Delaware incorporated company, so that there are few, if any, barriers to their operations in all of the major markets where English is spoken. That becomes the default of their operating system. So I think, what would I love to see from Japanese startups?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to see them incorporated in Delaware and using a startup attorney that has and understand a deep understanding of the global startup market and what are standard terms. I would like to see, them operating from day one in English so that you can go to Great Britain and you can go to the United States from the very first moment you launch, because finding product market fit is hard. And restricting yourself to just one market is limiting your ambition in a way that makes it harder to invest if you're an investor trying to get billion-dollar returns.
Yeah, great. So that's why I started to do the English interview. So Japanese startup and the VCs should know more about the global situation and from you guys. So yeah, I want this content become the trigger to be interested in the other countries' situation. So that's why I started this interview. So I'm very honored to hear that from you. We are about to finish.
Sounds great.
So is there any message to the Japanese startups or the Japanese startup ecosystem players from your insight?
I mean, I think that the only message I would leave you with for Japanese founders and other investors is that Sozo would love to invest in a company that happened to be headquartered here. We don't really see most startups thinking about themselves as an American company or a British company or a Spanish company. A lot of startup founders today are actually incorporating in the US and letting their teams be distributed all over the world. And they want nothing more than to build a business that's in every country.
Yeah.
And so I would love to see startups in Japan that come to our office in Shinmaru and and they pitch us on their company that is global from the beginning. And maybe even built in Japan for the US market first and then coming to Japan afterwards, or then going simultaneously to both markets, because I think you can learn a great deal understanding the biggest markets in the world, and certainly the U.S. for many businesses is the biggest market in the world.
So you mean the Japanese founder can ask Sozo Ventures to invest to go global?
We would love to help a Japanese startup go global. Our network is focused on bringing companies into Japan. Today, but that's not to say that we wouldn't love to expand that in the future.
So not only go to Japan, but also go to global from Japan is also your target.
Absolutely. We consider ourselves, sort of post-product market fit investors. We want to see those the best pre-product market fit VCs putting capital into Japanese companies, because they're the ones that have the understanding of what it takes to go from, founding a company to an IPO, right? And that is a unique skill set by investors, and they have, the best pre-seed, seed investors in the world. We want to see them investing in Japan so that we can come in and invest alongside them like we do in the US and elsewhere.
Thank you so much. Your insightful messages. Yeah. And we are finished in this session. So I'm so miss you, but
thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I'm rooting for you, and let's cooperate together to build a good startup ecosystem in Japan also. Thanks so much for coming.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Have a nice day.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, finish. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Of course. That was fun.
Yeah, I felt so fun. I enjoyed it. Yeah, you also enjoyed this.
Yeah,
I think so
I
much.
did for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're really smart to be doing English interviews. I think you'll get more readers, and I think a lot of people are curious about the Japanese ecosystem.
Really,
and having more content out there in English will only help you.
Yeah.
So Japanese subtitles or dubbing both. I don't know how you do it.
It's difficult. And
your English is great.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Great.
Encouraging me. So I try to speak English more friendly, and I have to try the good subtitle in Japanese also. I want be the startup ecosystem more globally and wonderful one. So I promise to make an effort.
Doing a great job.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah. Terrific. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to our event. And
Sorry.
Shinmarubiru.
Yeah, Shinmarubiru. Yeah.
Do you have more interviews today?
Just only you, actually.
All right.
So.
Well, thank you for coming just for me.